Again, those who aren't here, as just a reminder, I'm Bill Purcell. I'm the Senior Associate Director here at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. And again, we're excited to have you here. And again, very rich and hard questions, but Michelle's still here. I see that she survived. And again, I thought she was extremely generous with her answers, giving folks time for that. Just a couple quick announcements before I turn things over to Dr. Margie File and Marie Dennis. Again, I just want to let folks know that so all the different colloquiums are in this building. So the breakout will be in this building. Tonight, for the dinner, though, is at the Morrison at the which is across the street. So the dinner this evening at 6:30 will be across the street. Mass is at 5:15, is at the Basilica. And just so you know, if you make a right out of here, use the Gold Dome as your main kind of element of where to go. It's just to the left of the Gold Dome. And so you can follow folks for Mass at 5:15. But again, back here at 6:30 at the Morris Inn at 6:30. Today, lunch is on your own. And so you know, there's different places on campus, and it's in your booklet. There's also some places just off of campus. At the very edge of campus, it's called Eddy Street Commons, and there's a number of places, especially if you're speaking at people after your colloquium and if you're running a little late. And again, we finished at 12:15, but we're beginning back here at 2 p.m. for the next sessions. And again, we want to respect people and try to be there at their sessions because all of you have done all this work for these papers and stuff. You want people in the crowd. So, but I want to make sure people have enough time for lunch. And you could, if you wanted to go to Eddy Street Commons, you should have enough time for there also. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know, or any concerns, let us know how we can help you out. But again, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Margie File. Margie is a member of the Center for Social Concerns, as well as in the Department of Theology, and is again a leading voice, especially on peace. And she's very humble. But she actually founded the St. Peter Claver Catholic Worker in South Bend. And she's very involved in the housing program right now and is running a program, Motels for Now, helping those who are chronically homeless and helping them be housed. And has had her hands full dealing with many different people of many different levels, trying to make sure that housing gets met in our community. So I'm going to turn things over to Margie File.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'd just like to invite us to take a moment to center ourselves as we begin today and be mindful that we're in God's presence. And we pray, come, Holy Spirit. Amen. It's really my great honor to introduce Marie Dennis. Marie is a hero of mine. She's also past president of Pax Christi International, the global Catholic peace movement, and director of Pax Christi's Christian Nonviolence Initiative, Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. Marie worked with the Maryknoll Missioners from 1989 to 2012, and that includes 15 years as director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. She holds a master's degree in moral theology from Washington Theological Union, as well as honorary doctorates from Trinity, Washington University, and Alvernia University. She is author or co-author of 7 books, editor of Choosing Peace, The Catholic Church Returns to Gospel Nonviolence from Orbis Books, and co-editor of Advancing Nonviolence in the Church and the World from Pax Christi. With gentle persistence, Marie has stoked personal and communal moral imagination in the Catholic Church to envision the possibilities of gospel nonviolence. I don't think I can adequately express how pivotal Marie's leadership has been in recent years, working with the Vatican to generate and stoke this conversation and gather people from around the world to enter in for cradle Catholics like me who never heard about nonviolence until I arrived at college here in the 80s, I think it's a great service to the Church, Marie, that you've performed. And so for that, we all thank you and we welcome you here. So please join me in welcoming Marie.
Thank you, Margie, for that very generous welcome. Thank you to Bill and to Margie and to Paula, to all at the Center for Social Concerns for this lovely invitation. It's very, very nice to be with you all. As you know, today is the anniversary of the assassination in El Salvador of Archbishop Oscar Romero. In so many ways, Romero's life and witness offer remarkable insight into the excruciatingly difficult challenge that we are facing today. The challenge of interpreting Jesus' words and witness from the Beatitudes to the cross in these times. How do we, as followers of Jesus, respond to gun violence in our own U.S. communities, to the wars in Ukraine and Yemen, the DR Congo, South Sudan, and beyond, to violence against migrants and against nonviolent demonstrators in Iran and Myanmar and Russia, and again, beyond, to human trafficking, to racism, to destruction and exploitation of our common home, and on and on. Last month in Palestine, I saw the devastating consequences of occupation, the violence of an apartheid system, children killed and imprisoned, recently demolished houses, a massive wall separating families from their land and from each other, children from their schools, people from their olive trees. Despite the dehumanizing brutality, however, the people stay. They call their steadfastness sumud, a powerful expression of nonviolent resistance. 2 weeks ago in South Sudan, I saw the results of a bloody civil war following a bloody civil war. Unrelenting, multi-dimensional violence, war and military violence, extortion, corruption, torture, disappearances, gang violence, domestic violence, cultural violence, gender violence, the dehumanizing violence of deep poverty, all strangling a people who fought to be free, but who have not yet tasted peace. But I also witnessed there the prophetic stance against violence and injustice of South Sudan's Christian leaders and their powerful commitment to nonviolence. At Pax Christi International meetings in Europe this winter, I saw devastating consequences of the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine and heard the anguish of a peace movement in Europe and beyond that is mortally wounded after 78 years of building an international infrastructure for peace and human rights. But I also know that people in Ukraine and Germany and Poland and Austria and beyond are hungry for alternatives to war and are acting with courage and creativity to support effective nonviolent forms of resistance to the Russian invasion. Given the reality that we humans face on a daily basis, are the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, simply impossible to follow? Many believe that the war of aggression against Ukraine is challenging the very idea that gospel nonviolence could ever become a widely applicable ethic, but I believe precisely the opposite. Jesus proclaimed a new nonviolent way of life that was rooted in inclusion, in the beloved community, in mercy, and in the unconditional love of God. And he did so in the context of a brutal Roman occupation. He was so completely engaged in transforming unjust structures and interrupting violence, even the violence of his defender, Peter, the night before he died, that Jesus was hung on a cross as a dangerous threat to those in power. We will retell that story in dramatic liturgies in the coming 2 weeks. As we walk the way of the cross with the condemned Jesus, what will we learn that can help clarify a way forward now in these times? The war in Ukraine is not only a catastrophe in itself, it already has begun to fuel a new arms race and to recenter the insane and morally bankrupt strategy of nuclear deterrence. At a time when the world urgently needs to address climate change, to meet the needs of the most marginalized and impoverished communities, and to abolish the systemic violence of racism and exclusion, the Ukraine war is taking us in a calamitous direction. While international law and our own moral tradition provide sovereign nations with the right to self-defense, in a world of highly destructive, extremely expensive weapons, the human and environmental consequences of armed self-defense cry out for an effective alternative. For the sake of present and future generations, we have to replace the logic of violence in which we are mired now with a new logic of nonviolence. Excuse me. Otherwise, we will be perpetually trapped exactly where we are now, convinced that self-defense is only and always armed, that only weapons and military might can interrupt violence and protect threatened communities. The question is not whether to defend against a brutal military invasion, but how. Especially how to imagine and build a new paradigm where nonviolent options are increasingly viable and effective. Nonviolence has been a hallmark of Pope Francis' response to war and violent conflict, whether in Ukraine or the DR Congo or South Sudan or Syria or elsewhere, excuse me, in what he calls a Third World War fought piecemeal. In Fratelli Tutti and in scores of statements about the war in Ukraine, Pope Francis has repeatedly placed nonviolence as the lens through which to evaluate any crisis. He has clearly condemned Russia's aggression. He has repeatedly expressed his solidarity with the Ukrainian people. And he has tried to facilitate a path to peace that would prevent an expanded and prolonged war and even more unimaginable violence. The Catholic Church needs, and I believe is moving toward, a new moral framework, not a revision of the just war tradition. This new moral framework will move nonviolence to the center of Catholic teaching, even as it precisely negotiates an ethical response to the complex expressions of violence encountered in any crisis. The realization of a new paradigm based on nonviolence is even more necessary than it was a year ago, and more difficult. Given the ongoing carnage in Ukraine, the potentially catastrophic consequences, and our collective inability to imagine a way out of war, I deeply believe that Pope Francis' assertion, his repeated assertion that there is no such thing as a just war rings true. Thomas Merton once said, "The task of the Christian is at least to make the thought of peace once again seriously possible." That, I believe, is the vocation of the Church, and it is exactly what Pope Francis is trying to do. It's a huge challenge, not only in Ukraine, but also in the United States, in Syria, in South Sudan, in an uncounted other contexts. Pax Christi is convinced that in the long run, nonviolence is the only way to make the thought of sustained peace seriously possible, the only way to follow Merton's plea. And we are finding more and more people on every continent and in the institutional Catholic Church who are open to that possibility. Although Cardinal McElroy, a few weeks ago here at Notre Dame, agreed that given the dire circumstances, the moral claim for military action in defense of Ukraine is compelling. He used the word unassailable. But he also repeatedly said that comprehensive nonviolence must stand as the central point of reference for the church on armed conflict. Nonviolence is not the same as pacifism. It is a spirituality, a way of life, an ethic that is potentially universal, and a proven, often effective approach to preventing or interrupting violence, to protecting vulnerable people and the planet, to promoting just peace. Nonviolence is not passive. It does not retreat from conflict. It actively engages and transforms conflict for the common good. It is a courageous force for mercy and reconciliation. I believe that nonviolence is essential to the logic, the paradigm toward which humanity has to shift if we and the beautiful planet that we call home are going to survive. Nonviolence is also not magic. It is not always, or not yet, up to the monumental task of stopping a brutal military invasion. At the same time, nonviolence is woefully underfunded, especially in comparison to the world's, or to the United States, investment in weapons, in military training, and in other preparations for war. Nonviolence, spiritual formation, and nonviolence education are almost never included in elementary schools, including Catholic elementary schools and high schools, or across disciplines, perhaps excluding peace studies in Catholic universities, with some important exceptions, such as research into the impact of trauma healing in preventing future violence, and the great work that has been done around effective peace building. Rigorous research into the impact of particular nonviolent strategies in different contexts is only beginning to come into its own. El Salvador in the late 1970s presented a challenge like that of Ukraine, of extreme violence being perpetrated against the civilian population and against the church. You remember several priests, Rutilio Grande, Alfonso Navarro, Ernesto Barrera, Octavio Ortiz, Rafael Palacios, and Alirio Macias were assassinated, and scores of pastoral agents were killed or disappeared. Security forces fired into nonviolent demonstrations and viciously attacked local communities that they accused of supporting the guerrilla forces. Tortured bodies were found in garbage dumps on the beach, floating down rivers. You remember that, many of you. Throughout, Archbishop Romero repeatedly rejected violence, institutionalized violence, the repressive violence of the state, seditious or terrorist violence, and any form of violence that was likely to provoke further violence. He walked a very fine line, acknowledging the possibility of legitimate insurrection, a legitimate revolution, but warning about the danger of creating new injustices, a new disaster, more violence. And he clearly held out the then unthinkable possibility of forgiveness, of loving the enemy, including the army, the death squads, the US government that was then sending $3 million a day in support of that war. Romero said, and I quote, "Let us be firm in defending our rights, but with great love in our hearts, because to defend our rights in this way, we are also seeking the conversion of sinners. This is the vengeance of the Christian." I repeat what I have said so often, addressing by radio those who perhaps have caused so many injustices and acts of violence, those who have brought tears to so many homes, those who have stained themselves with the blood of so many murders, those who have hands soiled with torture, those who have calloused their consciences, who are unmoved to see under their boots a person abased, suffering, perhaps ready to die. To all of them, I say, no matter your crimes, they are ugly and horrible, but God calls you and forgives you. Many years ago, Barbara Deming described well the two hands of nonviolence. One hand that stops and prevents injustice and repression, and the other that reaches out to the perpetrator as a human being. Love your enemies, Jesus said. Archbishop Romero did. On February 22nd, almost a year after the invasion of Ukraine, Pope Francis said, "The toll of dead, wounded, refugees, and displaced persons, destruction, economic and social damage speaks for itself. Can the Lord forgive so many crimes and so much violence? Is he the God of peace? Let us remain close to the tormented Ukrainian people who continue to suffer, and let us ask ourselves, has everything possible been done to stop this war? I appeal to those in authority over nations," he said, "to make a concrete commitment to end the conflict, to achieve a ceasefire, and to start peace negotiations. The victory, built on rubble, will never be a real victory." Despite the overwhelming signs to the contrary, however, I believe that we are on the threshold of a new way of being, a new paradigm, a new logic for life, and that embracing gospel nonviolence at the center of Catholic life and teaching will help us move in that direction. Nonviolence is, but is not only about war and peace, not only about pulling back from the brink of human and ecological devastation. It is also about building right relationships between humans and with the earth, with the natural world. In a recent issue of The Tablet, Thomas Halleck, a professor at Charles University in Prague, remembered Teilhard de Chardin as one of the first prophets of globalization, who believed that humankind would eventually turn toward a single force, quote, "a single force that unites without destroying," the force of love as understood in the gospel. Halleck believes that this decisive moment is happening right now, and that the turn of Christianity toward synodality, the transformation of the church into a dynamic community of pilgrims, can have an impact on the destiny of the whole human family. Nonviolence is a powerful force that unites without destroying, an essential dimension of the beloved community, what Emmanuel Katongole calls a spirituality that reflects the very nature of God. It rejects violence in all its forms, yes, war and physical violence, but also structural and systemic violence, gender and racial violence, cultural, ecological, economic, spiritual, and psychological violence. This new nonviolent paradigm is based on a completely different understanding of our place as humans in the whole Earth community, latecomers as we are to the spectacular cosmic reality that we are just now beginning to see. It helps us to understand that diversity and relationality are embedded in the cosmos and essential to survival on this planet. And as we heard last night from Michelle, we need to more and more try to understand what that means. Elia Delio talks about the new person emerging in evolution who is embracing pluralities of gender, race, and religion, who is called into a, quote, "new type of consciousness where things are first seen together and then as distinct within this togetherness." She affirms that we are being rewired for belonging to the cosmic whole. We are more and more aware that we are one Earth community. We have a planetary consciousness and are beginning to see that systems in nature do not work on principles of competition and struggle, but on cooperation and sympathy. Michael Nagler, founder of the Meta Center on Nonviolence in California, talks about the new story that is replacing the old story, told by the dominant white culture about scarcity, competition, and violence. He insists, Michael Nagler, that violence is not the nature of humans, that love, faith, trust, and desire for community, peace, and well-being are central to our identity, and that nonviolence is a creative power, a pervasive energy, a fundamental principle that we can develop and deploy in human interactions. Violence, he says, is a tendency that pulls us back, away from the recognition of unity. Nonviolence pulls us forward toward that recognition. We human beings can play an active role in our own evolution and consequently in that of our species. The discovery of our capacity for nonviolence, as it is with higher consciousness or love, is key to this development. Nonviolence is not only at home in the new story, Michael Nagler says, it is the new story. That, I think, is the nature of the nonviolence that the church is learning to embrace. It is a new way of thinking that could guide the world, including in times of crisis like we're in now, toward just peace rather than justified war, toward respect and inclusion rather than exploitation. It is also a very old way of thinking that so often characterizes the worldview of Indigenous peoples. Those of you who have read Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass might know what I mean. A sample of her writing, quote, "Cultures of gratitude must also be cultures of reciprocity. Each person, human or not, is bound to every other in a reciprocal relationship. Just as all beings have a duty to me, I have a duty to them. If an animal gives its life to feed me, I am in turn bound to support its life. If I receive a stream's gift of pure water, then I am responsible for returning a gift in kind. An integral part of a human's education is to know those duties and how to perform them," she writes. Our commitment should be to a nonviolence that imitates Jesus' way of life, but that is also challenged and shaped by the history and the contemporary experience of those who are on the receiving end of war and racism and neglect and planetary destruction. It is not just not violent, but is powerful and actively engaged in preventing or interrupting the violence that is embedded in our society and in so many others, by the way we relate to each other, by the way too many in our society have been or are still being bruised, broken, killed by the system, and by the way we humans treat the earth. The nonviolence moving to the center of Catholic teaching on war and peace is a more accurate, expanded, evidence-based, and comprehensive approach to nonviolence that is capable of mobilizing a wide spectrum of tools for change, from nonviolent diplomacy to trauma-informed healing, to restorative justice, to nonviolent civilian protection and civil resistance, to nonviolent communication, and on and on. And it is a nonviolence that energetically promotes just peace, the new story, the beloved community, the new creation. I see this shift happening everywhere. And I suspect you also, know thousands of people, whole communities around the world who are giving their lives to making the new story real. I see it in brilliant work to root out systemic racism, to end the death penalty and mass incarceration, to redress centuries of oppression against Indigenous communities, to break habits of exploitation that are destroying the earth, to learn and promote restorative justice practices, to welcome migrants and refugees, to rid the world of nuclear weapons, to fundamentally rework U.S. budget priorities, to celebrate diversity and promote unwavering inclusion and respect for the rights of all people, no matter how they identify, believing that radical inclusion is the foundational message of the Sermon on the Mount. I see it in efforts, including my own, to be respectful and deeply inclusive in our use of language, including pronouns, in growing awareness of where our feet are planted. In Washington, D.C., where I live, we acknowledge with gratitude and deep respect to elders, both past and present, that we occupy the traditional land of the Anacostans, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey people. Here in South Bend, we gather in the traditional homelands of other Native peoples. I see the new story of nonviolence in Pope Francis' vision, creativity, and commitment to the cry of the earth and the cry of those forced to live on the margins of our world. As he looks around the world, recently at the DR Congo and South Sudan, during his visit there, he is clearly horrified, pleading again and again for the paradigm shift so desperately needed away from the direct violence of war and militarization, the cultural violence of indifference and domination, and the structural violences of racism, economic injustice, ecological destruction, and more. I see the new story I see the new story of nonviolence in countless communities around the world, most recently, as I mentioned earlier, in the extremely challenging context in South Sudan, where the heads of all the Christian churches together made a remarkable commitment to nonviolence. They said, "The Church of Christ in South Sudan recommits itself to gospel nonviolence. It rejects any form of violence and commits itself to a prophetic stance against violence and injustice. This is not a passive approach, not simply submitting to or colluding with violence, but it is active and prophetic in responding to all forms of violence amongst individuals, families, clans, tribes, and political and military factions, and including the systemic violence embedded in our cultural, societal, and political life." That from all of the church leaders in South Sudan together. The General Secretary of the South Sudan Council of Churches, Father James Oyet, introduced their statement with a press release saying, "His Holiness Pope Francis has revealed the sacrament of nonviolence. Here in South Sudan, the symbol becomes substance as we embody visible acts of nonviolence. Let it be our church institutions who teach, preach, and heal through the sacrament of nonviolence for the salvation of Mother Earth and all her children." Beautiful. The sacrament of nonviolence. The symbol becomes substance. I see a shift also in the intense process of discernment now underway to try to imagine and promote effective nonviolent ways to end the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine, as difficult as that is to imagine, and to heal the wounds of that brutal war. I see it in courageous, remarkable nonviolence in action across Ukraine, where many Ukrainians are already demonstrating clearly and with great courage that nonviolent defense can be effective and could be much more readily available with significant investment in resources, training, and research. In Ukraine, unarmed civilian resistance of different kinds has hindered institutionalization of the Russian invasion, has protected many civilians. Many have not been protected, but many have been through nonviolent resistance, has undermined the Russian narrative, has built community resilience, has strengthened local governance, has built social cohesion. Farmers have refused to sell grain to Russian soldiers. Fire departments have refused to work under a Russian mandate. Resistors have protected local administration officials and school directors. They have created an alternative government in different places, and they have engaged Russian civil society with anti-war messaging. Has that stopped the invasion of Ukraine? Not yet. Has it made a difference in the lives of particular people, particular communities? Absolutely. The potential of well-organized, strategic, nonviolent action should not be underestimated, either during war or during the post-war transition. Hopefully, the experience of Ukraine will help the world learn important lessons about how nonviolent strategies might work, even in desperate situations. Strategic nonviolence and peace building are very effective partners. 6 years ago, in his 2017 World Day of Peace message, Pope Francis said, "To be true followers of Jesus today also includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence." Pope Francis said, "I pledge the assistance of the Church in every effort to build peace through active and creative nonviolence." Pax Christi's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is doing all that we can to take Pope Francis up on his offer, urging the Church to promote the necessary shift from an ethic of violence to an ethic of nonviolence through our efforts toward the Holy See, towards bishops and episcopal conferences, Catholic universities, religious congregations, diocesan and parish programs, and through church diplomatic efforts. We are still hoping for a magisterial teaching, possibly an encyclical on nonviolence, because we believe that an official Catholic document could provide the basis for a much deeper understanding of and commitment to gospel nonviolence over the coming years. We'll see what happens with that request. We do, however, see a leaning toward nonviolence in Catholic social thought, less of an inclination to dismiss nonviolence as naive, unrealistic, and a more serious effort to imagine a shift from the logic of violence to the logic of nonviolence. That movement is actually being enhanced by the synodal process, which is participatory, collegial, grounded in and energized by the creative spirit of God, affirming the nonviolent impulses of listening, dialogue, and working through differences. From this perspective, the current synod, in fact, can be understood as a global nonviolent practice to foster a more nonviolent church and world. Clearly, to reclaim the centrality of gospel nonviolence in Catholic life and teaching will also require a deep transformation of the internal life of the Catholic Church, the subject of some of your questions to Dr. Becca last night. But I believe that transformation slowly is underway. Either we will continue to live our way into the new story of right relationships and commit to developing and scaling up the diverse, powerful, nonviolent tools to provide protection and genuine security, to address root causes of conflict before it reaches such catastrophic proportions, or we will remain stuck in the old story that violence and war are inevitable. I just don't believe that. Pope Francis is responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a follower of Jesus, taking the Sermon on the Mount very seriously. In the midst of this crisis, he is shifting our gaze from a focus on justifying methods of war to ways of ending it. An astounding, widespread interest in nonviolence as an orientation and as a potentially universal ethic is actually beginning to come into focus. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative believes that a full integration of nonviolence into Catholic social teaching, wrapping around and supporting our deep commitment to Catholic peacebuilding, could enable the institutional Catholic Church to be a truly transformational force in the world, moving a broken world toward the just peace for which we all yearn. 1 year ago today, Pope Francis said, quote, "The real answer is not more weapons, more sanctions, more political military alliances, but a different approach, a different way to govern the world." And in Fratelli Tutti, he said, "What is important is to create processes of encounter, processes that build a people that can accept differences. Let us arm our children with the weapons of dialogue. Let us teach them to fight the good fight of the culture of encounter." Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Marie. You've given us much to contemplate and to talk about. So we have some time now for discussion, and there are 2 microphones here in each aisle, and so please approach the mic if you have a question.
Good morning.
Morning.
Is this on? Okay.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. My name is Dr. Peter Baltutis. I'm from St. Mary's University in Calgary, Canada. I want to thank you for your talk. Nothing short of inspirational. I mean that fully. The news story you speak of, it speaks to my heart. If my 7-year-old was here, she would say, it makes my heart happy. So to hear that,
Good.
It makes my heart happy. So my question for you is a personal one. When you began your talk, you listed through a litany of how the old story is destroying our world, and that makes my heart pained. How do you find hope in the midst of seeing humanity at its worst, seeing the old story manifest itself in cruel new ways? I'm just curious personally, how do you find resiliency to keep persisting in seeking out the new story in the midst of such an overwhelming old story? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I on the one hand, I end up where you suggested I might end up from time to time. But I really believe that the world is changing. I believe that in the last 8 years, there has been a change in people's openness to even think about a new story, to imagine a new way. So that gives me hope. And then, as I said, everywhere in the world, there are people who are making that new story real by what they do every day. That gives me hope. I see it in my own children and in their children because of what they're doing in their lives. So I, at a bottom level, I actually believe that or a lot of the kind of virulent ugliness that seems to be trying to hold on to an old story is a reaction to the fact that there actually is change afoot in our country and in our world. And so that's frightening. And I think that part of our challenge is to sort of help those who are terrified by the possibility that the old story needs to be put to bed, that to help people understand that it is for all of us that a new way of being needs to happen. And so I actually, even in the kind of ugliness of the debate in our own country, I really do see potential for ways to begin a new conversation, and especially the belief that we are making changes that are not superficial, that are not at a personal level, but we are actually addressing systemic and structural violences by the conversation, by the changes, by what we're learning. Racism is a wonderful example to understand the depth of structural and systemic racism. That's hard. It's a hard lesson to learn, but that we are trying to learn it is really hopeful to me. Yeah.
Hi,
Oops.
Michelle Denton. I'm a high school theology teacher, and I really appreciated everything you said. I was very interested, though, in one thing you said about education and with children, and how we can begin to introduce these concepts of nonviolence and peacemaking, nonviolent, active nonviolence, and working for justice. And I was wondering, one, are there any programs that are already out there that could be utilized, or what kinds of things do you see as important in bringing this message and teaching this to younger people?
Thank you. I absolutely do see education as key, education of the youngest children in our society all the way through. At the youngest age, I think, and some of you know that one of my daughters is a trainer in the Montessori program worldwide. And she has convinced me, I actually believe it, that if a child, a very young child, up to age 6, understands their own dignity as a human being, they will have a better capacity to understand and appreciate the dignity of everyone else. And so those very early lessons about who am I and what can I do and how do I make decisions are really important. Second example for me was watching one of the advantages of Zoom over the last 3 years is we got to see things that we never saw. So I was watching an exercise in a classroom with children who were about 10 years old, more or less. And I was watching the teacher help 2 children about that age negotiate a serious conflict that they had had, and to do it in a way that respected the personhood of the other. Those are the lessons that we need to learn from the earliest age. And then at higher levels, I think that understanding the connection of nonviolence to the heart of the gospel is a really important lesson that we don't often hear, because I think we don't quite know how to explain what it means. And I think our challenge is to learn, to figure out how to explain what it means. And then at the highest levels of education, besides learning about nonviolence, my hope is that Catholic universities will turn their research capacity of graduate students and others to understanding what methods of nonviolent action work under what circumstances and why, so that we just know. The book that Maria Steffen and Erica Chenoweth wrote 11 years ago that is very well known, Why Civil Resistance Works, was the first empirical study that compared nonviolent revolutions and violent revolutions. And what they showed was that nonviolent revolutions, trying to overthrow a dictator or a leader, were twice as effective as violent revolutions. They were not always effective, but neither are violent revolutions. I mean, it's not, this is a perfect answer, but it was, why are we not trying more nonviolent approaches? So at every level of education, I think education is absolutely key. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Marie. Thank you very much for your remarks. My name is Bill Murphy. I've been teaching moral theology and Catholic social teaching in seminaries for over about 20 years. And one of the things I'm always trying to think about is how can the teaching of the church be received by especially that audience, including Catholic social teaching, which is a challenge. And so my question is, what do you think about an approach that really is fundamentally emphasizing charity in moral theology and then nonviolence as kind of an aspect of that? Because it seems almost self-evident to me that you can make the most profound case that Christian ethics is about charity. But if you start, if I started with my audience with nonviolence, they would tune out instantly. But if you basically go back and emphasize that Christian ethics is fundamentally about charity, and that kind of looks like friendship. You're acting for the good of the other. You're spending time with them. So that's my basic question. But and then there's some of the context for why I'm asking it.
I think would be a great approach. It makes a lot of sense. I think you'd have to know your own students, your own audience. I guess that two things that I would add. One would be that they understand what violence is, that they come to understand violence as not only interpersonal, but that there is violence that is systemic and structural and cultural. That I think then helps anyone to understand why, yes, nonviolence is an expression of charity, but it is also engaging at the level of justice in a way that might be surprising. So I would, and then the other is help them to learn how to preach about it in seminaries. Please, we need to hear in our parishes, in our churches, what are we talking about? What was Jesus doing? So, yeah. Did you have more you want to add to that? Yeah.
Well, I think in the framework, for my audience, if I was going to try to get them to ever consider even like peacemaking activities, you got to have the right framework. So there are pieces to your talk that would help to make it credible. Things that you mentioned, you mentioned the peacemaking activities, justice, but then where did acts of nonviolence fit into a situation where many people in the society might think that they're sort of compelled to be using force. Like in Ukraine is going to be like the key example. And so it seemed like there were pieces in what you were saying where you could make an argument about, well, Christian ethics is basically about charity. It's about loving neighbor. So that's your fundamental stance. In that context, you're going to do peacemaking activities to try to prevent war. But then if it comes up, there's a place for nonviolent witness, and people need to be doing that.
Great. I'd be glad to talk with you afterwards to give you some specific examples and resources on that, because it is convincing. I find people get it when they begin to think, oh, you mean that actually had an impact? So yeah, I'd be glad to give you more. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Edward Andreyko, I'm a Franciscan here at Notre Dame. My question has to do with the Patriarch of Constantinople and Ukraine. Is there anything that you can enlighten us about that?
I'm not sure that I have anything much except just to recognize that whole interaction within the Orthodox churches has been so difficult over a very, very long time. And I don't know, is there a specific question or, like going in a particular direction? But that is certainly not, aside from trying to follow it myself and understand what's happening.
Certainly to say that it's difficult is an understatement, because the Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill is just an impossible figure right now, and this makes it massively difficult. And I believe the Patriarch of Constantinople took a strong stand in around 2017. I'm not quite sure. This was why I asked the question, but maybe someone else in the audience too. This is an incredibly important area.
It is very important, yes.
Thank you.
And I know that many years ago now, in the late 70s and into the 80s, Pax Christi International was actually asked by the Vatican to host a dialogue with the Russian Orthodox Church in an effort to try to engage a conversation with the church that was so tightly affiliated with the government, with the regime in Russia. And I think that has continued, and that at a fundamental level, the dependency or the closeness has created huge problems. But it's a good question. I'll try to find out some more.
Luckily, we have the Nanovic Institute here, which does address that, and I'm very proud of saying that. I mean, they're not paying me to plug. Actually, I don't mind. Clemens is here. I'll take $20 from him anytime. But thank you.
Good. Then it would be great to learn more from your work, all of you, to help understand what's the impact. Is there a route through this really difficult situation toward peace?
It has to be. Those two churches have to.
Be. Yeah.
With all the complexities, you have to unravel, as you have beautifully unraveled all of this, and why I stand perfectly aligned with you as a Franciscan, and all of my other Franciscans would be, who listened carefully.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, yes, Richard Miller, Professor of Theology and Sustainability at Creighton. Thank you very much for your talk. I think this is an incredibly important topic. So when I teach the climate emergency to students, it's overwhelming. So if we're actually going to be truthful, the time frames are so short. The corruption is, we're just the United States is the world's leading fossil fuel extractor. And what's really frustrating to me as somebody who's in the past 5 years been a student of Gene Sharp and Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan is we actually do have power. And so my question to you is, in your discussions with the Vatican and your work, it's one thing to talk about that there is, and I agree with you, this sense of what Paul Hawken calls the planet's immune system, hundreds of thousands of peace and justice organizations. But to move them from this transformation intellectually to actually there's an art form. We know a fair amount how it works. We have lots of examples. We actually could be very effective. And as Erica Chenoweth showed, you only needed 3.5% of the populations to do this. So in your work with the Vatican, I'm trying to communicate this to universities that this should actually be part of an extension of an ethics as a core curriculum in the situations that we are. So I wanted to get your input on your work on that.
Fabulous. I totally agree. I think that one of the challenges that we've been dealing with over these last, 10 years has been trying to help people understand that nonviolence is civil resistance, but it's not only civil resistance, that it's a broad spectrum of ways of living. But I do think, and actually it's interesting that you're from Creighton, because the Creighton student and graduate who asked Pope Francis so clearly in that Zoom gathering with him whether the church would help set up training in nonviolent action at Catholic universities. We were cheering for that, and I've been in touch with those students, and we are really looking for ways to do that. It's a great example, I think, of what, in the beginning of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, Pax Christi has been committed to nonviolence for 75 years. But after the Iraq War, when and the 9/11, when millions of people were in the streets saying war is not going to solve this, and it was just brushed aside, we started to think about, well, where do we have any power that we could actually make a difference? And we figured, well, we're a Catholic peace movement. Let's see if we can get the institutional church to turn all of its capacity for education and training and moral formation to building the skills to do that. And I think keep pushing, because I really do believe that the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis that we are seeing up front and close to us right now is not going to change until we are organized enough to demand change. And what does that look like? There aren't very many institutions that cover the reach of the Catholic Church. It gets a little tricky because I don't think anybody wants to imagine the Catholic Church organizing civil resistance all over the world. But we need to find ways to talk about that in order to claim the power that we have to make a difference. And I think that's true in the climate crisis. It's true. I mean, why are we not moving rapidly to change the way we live? We've known this for how many decades? It's the same thing about war. I think there's just too much profit in the whole process. And we need to find a way to claim our power and move past that, but it's not easy. So please keep asking and keep teaching those Creighton students what you're teaching them. It's great.
Yeah, that wasn't by accident that they asked that.
I am sure it was not. But it was great. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. Sorry. Hi, I'm Megan. I'm an undergrad at Notre Dame, and I'm studying political science, peace studies, and Catholic social tradition. So I really appreciated this talk. It brought all my interests together.
Good.
I just wanted to ask you what your advice was for young people who are going out into a world that's beginning to imagine this new story of nonviolence, but it hasn't fully realized that. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, I think maybe the most important thing is to keep to keep asking the questions, putting out the ideas that you have, bring them into whatever work you do, whatever is your field, whether it's in political science or in peacemaking or wherever. Don't let the possibility of nonviolent options be dismissed as unrealistic. Do research. Turn your own years in the academy to understanding how nonviolence works, and just keep your hope alive and keep talking about it among your friends. It's not a lot, but it is a lot. I think that's really what we need is we need to nurture the imagination to believe that another way really is possible. And that has to overcome a lot of obstacles because we've been stuck in this old story for a long time. And so keep telling your version of the new story and stir people's imagination. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Josh Chen, sociology faculty at Belmont Abbey College. You talked about the power to make a difference earlier. You talked about, continuing to talk about the potential of this approach. Sociologists are naturally cynical and idealistic at the same time.
Okay.
I'm wondering how you have responded, because I'm sure you must have in your long career, to cynical views that nonviolence is the approach taken by the powerless, right? And that any lasting social or systemic change needs to happen in the halls of power, right? So there's two pieces to this. One is there any, from your perspective, is there any reality to that? The idea that, other than local small change, like real systemic change needs to happen, with those at the top, and whether or not, you see any validity to that. But secondly, to what extent nonviolence is taken up by people with power, right? And so to give an example, you've talked about racism. We can talk about the civil rights movement here in America, and people like to tout it as a success. And it abolished explicit racism, but we know the black-white wealth gap has not changed, residential segregation has only gotten worse, right? So to what extent has lasting change actually happened?
Yeah.
So I'm curious what your response is.
Great points, and I can share my thoughts about it, but I'm not sure how helpful they'll be. First of all, I agree that nonviolence is often the weapon of the powerless, of the margins. But I also think what came to my mind as you said that was a belief that is where change will come from, that is where power is rested. The question is, do we recognize from the margins? Do we recognize how much power is there? So it's one piece. I mean, Pope Francis is always pushing us to the margins, telling us to turn to the margins for wisdom. And I think one of the bits of wisdom there is that nonviolence can work. I also agree that the level of change that's needed, whether it has to do with the climate or it has to do with racism or you name it, poverty, whatever, is systemic, it's structural. There are places where it is embedded into our laws and into our practices and into our power. So I think that I do believe that power is in the people, if you will, and that our engagement where it's possible with political decision makers is key. So one of the things that we've done, that we're doing as a Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, is to try to articulate what would it look like for political decision makers at different levels of society, from a local city council to the UN, to pass laws and promote policies that would support a nonviolent approach. And we have we published a small booklet that identified 10 different examples at different levels. We think that's really important, that we really do need to engage the political decision makers. But I think that has to be accompanied with a sort of people power decision. Now, it gets really complex in different countries. Obviously, there are different abilities to affect political decision makers or not, and that this is not going to be a quick fix. But I think that it's both and. The power, we do have the power to make change wherever we are. I mean, look at what's happening over the last 10 years, we've seen extraordinary examples of civil unrest, some of which have been brutally repressed in Syria and elsewhere, some of which have had some success. And I believe that eventually that kind of civil society movement will help move us in the right direction. We'll see. Yeah. Yes.
I'll just say that we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, these two.
Hi, my name is Ed Gaffney. I used to teach here. I'm retired now. And law and international law and my work as an ecumenical officer for the church here in the United States lead me to want to go back to the Franciscan. Where is he? But doing work with the differences between Moscow and Constantinople is truly important, and so is it for all of us, especially at Creighton, a great leader in this way of getting down to the roots of what you've been telling us of popular presence of nonviolence as a genuine Catholic teaching and action. I have found more, let me put it this way, when I'm hanging on with my fingernails to Roman Catholicism, I have enough Jewish, Muslim, and across-the-board Christian friends to encourage me to remain fast in my Catholic commitments. We are not alone in this world. The very thing you just said about getting cities to do things is precisely the difference between Constantinople and John Courtney Murray and religious freedom and the rest of it. We were ourselves enmeshed in the darkness of Christendom. We were doing it every century and killing people, or at least being the willing complicit characters that gave arguments in favor of the horrendous wars that were waged in the name of the cross and why the cross was put on top of every single church in the world, that is a Roman Catholic one. So this complete transformation that has been on the way, not just in the last 8 years, but the last, let's say, 50 and 60 years of Vatican II and paragraph 80 on, has called all of us in this world to reflect on the so-called, benefits of World War I and the good war in which now the forces of military might were turned against civilians. That's what happened in World War II. About 1 million people died in World War I. Most of them, overwhelmingly most of them, soldiers in really crappy trenches and things like that. World War II, it's more like 50 million, and it's people like you and me. Everybody can get that because every one of you here is a potential victim to such wars. But demythologizing our history, demythologizing the laws that have surrounded going to war, all of that is the task of serious scholarship, of course, because that's where you're going to find Jews who are doing terrific resistance against the Nazis, not because they had guns in the brave way that Hollywood like us to believe that the only way resistance comes from Jewish anger at being treated badly for centuries. It's rather this recurrent coming back here to find the strength to carry on. And I just applaud very much the work of you and all of your colleagues. But again, think of how many bishops are like Tom Gumbleton in this country. Think of why he ends his career as a bishop in Detroit without a home, a roof over his head that's called a rectory. There are ways that we have to acknowledge our own weakness as an institution, which is precisely why a bishop from Buenos Aires who took the subte every day to get to work or walked is going to the margins to tell us where the center is. Mm-hmm. If we leave it to PBS to line up somebody on the left, ha, 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 somebody on the right, ha, 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 to tell us where the center is, why come to Notre Dame? Come on. Because Notre Dame is giving us people like you and people like all of us to understand that we are the victims of this terrible misunderstanding of the power of violence.
Great, thank you. One more question.
I'm Roger Bergman, Professor Emeritus of Justice and Peace Studies at Creighton. Go Blue Jays. Big game tonight. I appreciated your reminder to us of the anniversary of Archbishop Romero's assassination 43 years ago today. In his fourth pastoral letter, which I think you were making reference to, he critiques various forms of violence, but basically in the final section affirms a kind of revised understanding of the Church's just war teaching. And the comments you made about Cardinal McElroy's recent speech here, which I have not learned about, suggests he was also taking a kind of both and approach, often said to characterize Catholic intellectual life, rather than an either or. You've presented it's either the old story or it's the new story. Well, the old story has something substantial in it that needs to be revivified and expanded, just as nonviolence needs a new form. So I would just like to suggest that there's a both and approach that is not just the old story, the new story. It's the two tensions, the tension between those things that is really creative. Obviously, I'm going to be presenting on that tomorrow. I have a book out there. I've thought a lot about this. You don't have to buy the book. And a long essay and expositions, the title of which sums up what I'm trying to say. You say Tertullian, I say Augustine. and we're in the same church, the same tradition, and both and.
Sure.
I appreciate your comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you speak to the crossing place of different points of view. There are a few things that I can say. I don't have an answer. I have what I believe at this point, which is that, first of all, I think we are at a place now where nonviolent strategies have not been sufficiently invested in that they can do what we need done. So we recognize that. I think that, however, I believe that, and I think this has been said by many people in different ways, that the just war tradition, as it is spoken about as the just war tradition, has been so badly used. It has been used to justify war after war after war, violence after violence. So my belief is that, yes, there is an area where we have to deal with the not yet, with the reality of violence, serious violence in our world. I think that to do that, it is not helpful, my own belief, to retool the just war tradition and to keep calling it the just war tradition, because I think it will always be misused as long as we talk about a just war. I think that when you look at the war in Ukraine, I don't think you can call that a just war with the level of suffering. Is there a legitimate defense? Absolutely. I think there's no question about that. Can it be armed? Right now, that's the option. But I really believe that we have the creativity to imagine a new, much narrower, very specific ethical frame to deal with particularly egregious present expressions of violence. I think that's what Cardinal McElroy is saying as well. He said, nonviolence at the center, but we have to figure out what is the guidance that the church can give in these extreme situations, one of which is Ukraine. So I don't think I think that where I am personally, and there would be many different opinions on this, is that the more we understand and move nonviolence to the center, the fewer occasions we will be faced with where we can't think of anything else to do but violence. And that's not going to be an easy move, because there are a lot of reasons, there are a lot of forces that are saying, no, use violence, use weapons, that's the only way to do it. I just think that we need energy, format, place to say we will learn what nonviolence can do. We will learn how nonviolence supports all that we've learned about peace building. And we will figure out how to deal with these extreme situations, counting on the fact that if we do a good job promoting nonviolence, building a logic of nonviolence, that we will have fewer and fewer of those extreme cases. That's not going to happen next week, But I really do believe as long as we say, well, maybe there are just wars, we will keep going back to that option rather than kind of forcing ourselves to imagine a new way. There's no easy answer now. There's no quick answer. So your questions are great. But thank you all very much. It was good to be with you.